Okay, so welcome to the second session of our Digital Epic Creative Writing for Architects course. You can see on the screen here, today I've called it voice. But in some ways we could be calling every session voice, because voice is always going to be part of what we're talking about and what we're using. So what I will do is I will talk you through some examples of ways in which writers have tried to make sense of the abundance of text which is available on the internet, and thought about what that means for creativity, whether we can even talk about creativity. Is this even the right word now? And there are various ways in which this has been attempted to explore. So we'll talk about some of those, and then we'll talk about ways that we could maybe try to push this further. And then at the end, you can have a go yourselves. So the first thing I was going to show you is actually from the 1970s. So if this works, you see this mouth here. This is from a very short piece from the writer Samuel Beckett, and it's called Not I, a performance piece, which is just a mouth. So to give you a flavor of it, so in thinking about voice, what voice can do, we get it to the right. Okay, just have a listen. I don't know how the audio is going to, it may not play so well, but I will send these to you and you can have a listen for yourself in your own time, but see if you can hear any of this. Possibly not.
There's no audio.
Because I'm not hearing, hang on.
Girl, yes, tiny little girl, into this, out into this, before her time, God-forsaken hole, called. No matter, parents unknown, unheard of, he having vanished, thin air, loosen up button of his breeches. She similarly, 8 months later, almost at the tick, so no love, spared that. No love such as normally vented on the speechless infant in the home. No, nor indeed for that matter, any of any kind. No love of any kind, at any subsequent stage. So, typical affair, nothing of any note till coming up to 60 when, what? 70? God! Coming up to 70 when, wandering in a field, looking...
Okay, I don't know if you could hear that at that point, but in that short piece, quite old now, the stage is completely black and all we have is this mouth speaking. So what I'm wanting to ask, or for you to think about, is who is speaking in this piece? It's called Not I, which is an interesting title in itself. And a lot of the things that we can talk about today and in general in this course is about getting away from the idea of this unified speaking self, which is where we historically or traditionally would have thought where the voice lies. But already in this, and I mean, yes, this is already last century, Beckett was quite radical in positing the voice outside of a kind of unified, coherent subject. This is just an abstract, this is an abstract mouth speaking. We don't know who it is. We don't know where that voice is coming from. So this is one step along the road that we're going to go along. And what you can also see on this screen is, this is from a website. Now, some of you may already know this, Ubu Web. I encourage you to check it out. That's also a picture, funnily enough, of Samuel Beckett. But Ubu Web is a fantastic resource of interesting texts, videos, images, all experimental in some shape or form. So that's something for you to have a look at. And the person who, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the person who designed this and manages it. who is a poet called Kenneth Goldsmith. Some of you may already know him as well. Why is this important? Well, Kenneth Goldsmith is one of the people who has more recently than this first example that we started with in the 1970s, he has pioneered his brand of what he sees as a way to push poetry and writing forward in the age of the internet. And one of the, I would say his most important text was in 2011, and he published a book called Uncreative Writing. And this was very influential at the time, and spawned a whole load of poetry, some of it terrible, some of it deliberately terrible, to show what we could do by simply taking things from the internet and challenging the nature of what creative writing could be. I gathered a few things that he said here. So Uncreative Writing was the text from 2011, and this is a more recent text of his where he's discussing the website I just showed you, UbuWeb. And so I just picked a few possibly interesting comments from his Uncreative Writing text, because this is one reference point for us in going forward to think what else can be done along this road. So he says uncreative writing is post-identity literature. He says piracy is preservation. So that's an interesting point about the nature of, especially in the academic world, when everybody is so concerned about plagiarism and copying, and everything must be your authentic work. You must not copy from another website or source without referencing properly. But that, in the age of the internet, becomes quite absurd. And so what Goldsmith is saying there is that actually to copy illegally someone else's text is a way to preserve it, because it's once it's there, once it's on the internet, it's kind of forever. So he's turning the idea of creative writing on its head there, saying we don't need the new sentence, the old sentence reframed is good enough. And most importantly for today, I think, language as material. In day-to-day life, we rarely notice the material properties of language, except for when, say, we encounter a stutterer or a person with a heavy accent. We first notice how they say. Second, we decode what they are saying. So language as material, this is a key point. Hold on to that thought, language as material. Once you start to think about language as material, then you can play around with it and use it to build things, to build new things. And that's what we're hoping to do. Other things, this bottom sentence, reading aloud is an act of decoding. Taken one step further, the act of reading itself is an act of decoding, deciphering, and decryption. So think about that. Why would reading aloud be an act of decoding? Once you read something aloud, it becomes a whole range of other dimensions are added. One of which is to foreground what the more material aspects of whatever it is that's being read out loud. If you're reading a poem out loud, your intonation might change up and down, the rhythm might change, the volume might change, the mood might change. All of those are variables which are material elements, which are a way of encoding or decoding a text. So this is Goldsmith. This is an interesting approach to think about, and there are more. So moving on, if we think more about materiality and the word not as this transparent vehicle of meaning, but the word as a thing, as an object that has weight, that can be manipulated.
Ja, ein bisschen ungenau geschafft damals.
Can someone, can everybody make sure that they're muted? Everybody muted, yes. So I've shown you here one example of what can be done with thinking about the word as a material thing, and that's concrete poetry. This is another interesting reference point for us, because it can, and this is something, if you go back to Renaissance times, if you go back to this George Herbert, so in 1633, he wrote a concrete poem. This is not something which was only born in the 20th century. He was writing anagrams in his poems. He was writing concrete poetry. So you can see how in this poem Easter Wings, the shape is directly enacting what is being talked about. So that's concrete poetry. It's a kind of abstraction and it's a kind of concretion at the same time, and that's important. I'll come back to that. There's something going in two directions at the same time. As with this other poem, more recently, 1965, we have this poem Forsythia, which is in the shape of what it's talking about, plant. So concrete poetry, that's something else to play around with in terms of materiality. So what else could we do? If we break down words into smaller components, for example, letters, characters, and the word character is important. I'll come back to that. Let's see what else we could do. So anagram, you may or may, I guess most of you would know about an anagram where you rearrange letters from one word to make a different word. This is an interesting way of thinking about language as material. Each of the letters is a different item or unit to be rearranged, and lots of different ways to play around with that. I think if I click here, this will show you a little animation of the word Loch Ness Monster being rearranged in different configurations. So it's kind of, yeah. So you see what that can do there. If we go back, this poet K. Salam Muhammad has gone a little step further, and not just anagrams, but has called these sonograms. So these are exact anagrams of Shakespeare's sonnets, and each sonogram contains the same letters in the same distribution as its original. And then all the letters left over, once this sonnet in the correct meter has been written, these then form a title. And he has written a book called Sonograms, which does this with every single one of Shakespeare's sonnets, 154. So it's kind of silly, the poem itself, but again, this shows how not only is the word and language material, but it's a kind of malleable kind of material. We can reformulate, refabricate, move around as we like. Okay, so those are two different things that can be done. What else can be done then? Going back, thinking about what Goldsmith says about everything, the abundance of everything that is available to us. I talked that last week a little bit about using stories which are already there. So another interesting reference point for us is the idea of copying. The idea of copying as another interesting challenge to this notion of creativity or the original idea. So some of you may know this. So you have Don Quixote originally by Cervantes. And then you have various kinds of reiterations or copies happening. You have Borges, who wrote this text called Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote. And in this, he writes a fictional review of a text of this fictional author called Pierre Menard, who has written, copied out exactly in its original language, Don Quixote. And it's not a copy, is the point. So this makes us think, what is the notion of copying all about? It's described as an entirely new text. So I'm just leave you to think about that and what that means. I don't know, one or two of you may have read this or know this already as an interesting reference point to make us think about writing, authorship, etc. There's also, I'm a great fan of Kathy Acker. She published several texts with the titles of great works of literature. And inside are lots of different reference points to the text, but it's not the same as the copy with Borges. So that's just some other ideas about replication, about what authorship means, and those things. So I'm throwing lots of examples at you, and then I'm going to ask what we can do to push this further, and then I will bring in the text from Ludger and some other things developed by a colleague of mine at the chair, Miro Roman, who some of you know, or one or two of you know already, I think. So this is another poetry collection, which I think is interesting and relevant for us, published 2015, I think, talked about this a little bit last week, in which this poet, and this is published by Faber in London, a really high, top-notch publisher, and this Kim Kardashian's Marriage is a text in which he has assembled 72 short poems, which are kind of based on the 72 days that one of Kim Kardashian's marriages lasted. And the result is kind of funny, a little bit nihilistic. So a review described it, Kim Kardashian's marriage is basically only about its keywords as keywords in their meaning to the search algorithm, with its moments of incoherence justified by their relation to the process of composition. In this way, we have come to accept the relationship between words as data. So there is something going on there in the process of composition, and you can see in the index of titles, it's almost like that Google autocomplete that we talked a little bit about last week. And then this poem, Spooky Berries. Edgar Allan Poe has written a very eerie poem this month with many allusions to the latest botanical blogging. A very cute hand-carved natural pumpkin hanging about 6.5 feet in the air, and my little lens wasn't cutting it, so I popped on my big lens and got it all. So Sam Riviere has written short poems in the style of blog posts by Kim Kardashian. So there's a kind of satirical effect going on, and it's an attempt to, in the same way that Kenneth Goldsmith was talking about creating an effect which is not about creativity, it's about something else. There's a lot of layers going on there. So whether you like this or whether you find it kind of entertaining is almost not the point. But I wonder if, and there was a huge outpouring of internet poetry of this kind around about 2010, 2012 or so. And this was the time that Kenneth Goldsmith's Uncreative Writing came out. So this was the context. So we're a little bit further on now. And one of the things which I thought would be interesting for us in the wake of all of this is to think, what can we do beyond being kind of stuck in this mess of kind of infinite meaninglessness, let's say. What else can we do? How can we talk seriously about these things? That's something which we can start thinking about in the next weeks. Because it's being playful is great, but it's good to balance the playfulness with seriousness and talk about all the topics we want to talk about. We don't want to be stuck in this play, or play is fine, but we don't want to be always stuck in play because it doesn't go anywhere. So that's one of the main questions. How can we use this abundance to talk seriously? So I mentioned a colleague of mine, Miro Roman. He can't be here today, but he is going to come and talk to you about a library and a search engine that he's generated, that he's made, and the ways in which this can be used to articulate something new, so that it's not just a notion of copying. It's about picking, yes, selecting, curating, picking bits of language from texts that are already out there. There are millions of PDF texts available freely on the internet, so we're never suffering from a lack of these things. And then you can start to put things together in your way, and maybe then you can say something new yourselves using things which are already there. So that's and there's more detail to that, which I will leave for Miro to talk about. He's hoping to join maybe in the next. We have. Did someone say something? Don't think so. Yeah. So this is something which we can work with for sure. So now we go back to the text from Ludger, this text which I introduced last week, as we could maybe think about the idea of a digital epic and what does that mean? So we could say that a digital epic is impersonal, public, abundant, and the voice, and this is something which I think all of you can develop as we go along. The voice that's speaking is not you yourselves. You can locate the voice elsewhere. The voice goes on, but you can locate the voice elsewhere. So in place of an epic hero, this kind of self, this kind of subject, this protagonist who is going forth on this journey, we have elements. We have numbers, ciphers, we have code. And so what are the characters then? What are the characters that speak with a voice? Well, all of the things which are discussed in this text, and here we have a list: the circle and the line, numbers and letters, time and space, magic and myth, paradox and the infinite, matter and gravity, light and energy, particles and waves, the rational and the real, night and day, phonetic writing, Renaissance drawing and algebraic code, the Archimedean screw, cause and effect, geometry and mechanics, encoding and decoding, the Dedekind cut, the Turing machine, calculus and logic, subjects and objects, machines and engines, trivium and quadrivium, earth, air, fire, water, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, music, iteration, selection, recursion, programming languages, big data, AI, digital humanism, digital renaissance, and digital architectonics. So even in the process of me reading this list, something happens. Something happens to the elements which are being announced there. If you imagine, so you can start to dramatize something immediately. If there was a party happening, and these were all the guests arriving, and I was tasked with the job of announcing the arrival of these guests, and next arriving are the circle and the line, numbers and letters. This is a way to think about these elements as characters. And something happens, as we heard before, reading aloud is a kind of decoding. You can call it encoding, you can call it decoding, because these processes are happening somehow both in opposite directions at the same time. Something happens in that process. So what we are talking about here is not that we no longer use our imaginations. Absolutely not. Our imaginations are going wild in thinking about these things. It's just that the locus of the speaking voice is not this kind of self that we all supposedly have, not this identity that we hold on to. The speaking voice is set free and can play in whatever realm it wants to. So what I will invite you to do in this session, and we will spend a little bit of time doing this as an exercise, is to think and to take one of these elements, and we will start with the simple, well, I was going to say simple, but nothing is simple, arguably, and think about what we can do to give them a voice. And before we do that, though, I will give you a few more examples of texts which have tried to do this. And if we think about the idea of being playful and about being serious, also as kind of bi-directional processes, this is going to be helpful for us when we think about what it would mean to characterize, to dramatize a line or a circle, or a line and a circle. So this could be both a playful thing and a serious thing, and I think it needs to be both. So who else has done this so far? Do we know any examples of writers who have thought about these things? So in Ludger's text, not in the prologue, which I have given you to read so far, but later on, in a later section, he's talking about Le Corbusier and the poem of the right angle. Because I think this is a beautiful example of, and this is a section from it here, a beautiful example of a dramatization of an element. So in this case, it's the right angle, kind of brought to life in a certain way. So I have this is also available. I have the PDF of the whole poem of the right angle, which I can send round to you to have a look at. So I'll maybe read this, and the edition I have these beautiful illustrations as well. Some of you may already be familiar with this, I'm not sure. But I maybe can just read this little extract for you. Mind. To place at the tips of one's fingers, above all in one's head, an agile instrument capable of swelling the harvest of invention, clearing the path of thorns, clearing the way will confer freedom on your freedom. Spark stolen from the flame, the gods nourished to make the world play. Mathematics. Here is a fact. The fortunate, miraculous meeting, perhaps of one among several numbers, has furnished men with this tool. Appreciative, the philosopher said, good shall be simple and evil difficult. Its value resides in this. The human body has chosen number as its admissible vehicle. Whence proportion which orders the relations with our surroundings. Why not? What matter the opinion of the whale, the rock eagle, or the bee in this context? So that's quite an enigmatic section you have there. So, but you can see how there's dramatization of what numbers can do, what mathematics can do, and how it relates to the stories we tell ourselves historically as humans about with religions and good and evil. And how mathematics might play amongst those other stories. And the way it's written is that's also quite epic in its, as an adjective, kind of grand in its tone, and very beautiful. So yeah, I encourage you to read the rest of that. So that this is one example from Le Corbusier, but we have other examples as well. Earlier examples. For example, we have this from the 19th century. I don't know if any of you have read this text, this kind of satirical text from the 19th century. And Edwin Abbott is just coincidentally twice he's coming up in what I'm talking about today. Firstly, because Flatland is a kind of a dramatization of geometrical shapes and dimensions. So there's a narrative and all the characters are shapes. So this is kind of funny and has inspired the imagination of many people, one of which you can see in this next figure, from Derek Beaulieu, and what he did was to take all the letters out of Flatland and to just render it as lines, the text. So that's one example of trying to render something in a way which takes it out of representation and out of symbols and into something else. So this is one way in which Edwin Abbott's texts or thoughts have been somehow appropriated. But there's another interesting one, which is, he wrote this, it's a little bit blurry, but he also wrote this text in the 19th century, how to parse. So if you don't know the word, it is also used in computing, so maybe you're all familiar with the word parse. It's all, if you know about grammar and if you know about computational language, you know about this word. This is the definition, or the etymology. So it's about to break down into parts, specifically within grammar, to show what is the function of each little part of the sentence. Another writer called Craig Dworkin, what he did with Abbott's original text was to actually parse the whole text. Every single sentence in this original text from Abbott, he then broke it down into each part and what it is, what kind of class of word it is, and what function it has within the grammar. So that might sound a bit kind of confusing or overwhelming or boring, and he himself said it was a very long and tedious task. But what's left is another kind of poetry, I would say. So here's some little extracts from that text from Craig Dworkin. So you can see one normal sentence becomes article, noun, genitive, preposition, relative pronoun, period, relative pronoun, third person singular, etc. And that is a kind of coding right there. And when you extract the function from a particular grammatical structure, it somehow is then opened up and becomes full of potential meanings. So I would argue that this is really, I find this very beautiful, actually. The left-hand side is a part of a paragraph that's all been parsed. And the other one is a a part of the index of the book that's been parsed. So you can see how there's a lot of repetition there, because every element of the index is noun, comma, compound, Arabic, numeral, period. And this is the structure of how an index is put together with all the entries. But there's something about the laying bare of the function of these linguistic objects, or objects. There's something about that which is also quite beautiful, arguably. So these are some examples of how the materiality is played around with in different ways, serious and playful at the same time. So I'll just give you one or two more examples, and then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. And if you want to ask any questions, you can do. And then we will do some writing experiments together. So I will take you then back to Lewis Carroll in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I don't know if any of you know this poem. It's a famous example of nonsense poetry, even though it's not that nonsensical. And what's very interesting is to then look online, and there are one or two websites which show this poem in other languages, and then you can compare how the nonsensical words are translated across languages, because that's another really interesting way of looking at what the materiality of the word is. So this first stanza: "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves and the mome raths outgrabe." So the meaning is quite open, and it's fun to sometimes think to yourself, what is going on in my head when I'm hearing those words? What does brillig mean? What are slithy toves, etc.? So what can we do with that, though? How can we use what we just talked about, the quite technical ways of abstracting function from grammatical structures? How can we think that with this? What we can do is think about content and function words. And it's the content words which Lewis Carroll changes into his nonsense words, and the function words stay. So content words are nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives, which include information and meaning, and they add colour and variety to someone not muted, or okay, all good. And the function words, auxiliary verbs such as do, be, and have, prepositions, articles, conjunctions, and pronouns. So these are necessary grammatical bits in between the content words, and they connect up the content. So think about this content and the function. We can problematize content and function later if we want to, but for now, it's helpful to think about this distinction as we go on, and maybe we want to work with this Xenoteca library that I showed you earlier on, and then they become that any quotations, you might take an entire quotation and that's operating as the content, and you can create the function to glue the bits together, if that makes sense. So that's the blue and the red. The blue words are function words, the red words are content words, and you can see that the blue words are not nonsense and the red words are nonsense, or kind of they are made up words from the writer. So content and function words is a useful thing to hold on to. So I'm aware that I have just bombarded you with a lot of examples there. How then to pull a lot of these things together? Thinking back to the first thing I started with, materiality. Well, oh yeah, here, before I do that, this was an exercise. If we have time, we can actually try and do this, all of us, where you try to write one stanza of nonsense poetry using the template from Carol's Jabberwocky, where, so A, B means that the line A rhymes with A, and the line B rhymes with B, if that makes sense. And then, so you take out the content words, and I did a little parsing here at the bottom. Twas adjective, and the adjective noun in plural. So that's me showing what the functions of the content words are, if that makes sense. You can try and play around with this yourselves when I'm sending these slides round, because it gives you a really good kind of handle or grasp on how these things are put together. So, and which bits are making sense, which bits are arguably nonsense, and actually how formal this is. It's a very formal structure. And then even if it's just even if it's just to feel frustrated at how formal this structure is and want to break out of it, that's a good exercise to do. So I encourage you all to write your own version, filling in those blanks, twas and the blah, blah. Make up your own words. And then you just need to follow whether it's an adjective or a noun or a verb. So that's something for you all to do, but we'll have some simpler exercises to do actually in the session today. That could be an optional homework if you like. Okay, so now, how to pull all of these things together. So I think it's useful, and this is something which I have learned from reading Ludger's work and thinking with it, a kind of principle of symmetry when you're thinking about materiality. So, and then applying that to the things we've been talking about today. So I just wrote this now. Just as language is data, data is language. Just as we can be playful with serious things, we can be serious with playful things. Just as we can use characters as numbers, we can use numbers as characters. Just as we can be curators as creators, we can be creators as curators. And just as we can make nonsense from sense, we can make sense from nonsense, because these things are mobile. And when you go one way, you're always also going in the other way. So this is a helpful way I have found for thinking about these things. When you're doing something, when you're abstracting, you're also concretizing in some way. So I hope that makes sense. I will stop sharing my screen, and maybe we can turn your videos on and we can have a little discussion about all of the things that we've just that you've just seen. And also you can tell me any thoughts you have about the reading that I sent round for you for this week. Okay, so let me just recompose my screen and stop sharing.